The question itself hangs in the air, heavy with implication, a whisper that seems to echo down the vast marble corridors of the Vatican and through the silent, ancient libraries where dust motes dance in the slants of light-piercing stained glass windows. Why did the Vatican fear the Quran's secrets? It is a query that suggests a hidden history, a silent war of ideas fought not on battlefields with sword and shield, but in the secluded studies of cardinals, the coded pages of medieval manuscripts, and the deepest recesses of theological conviction. To even approach an answer, we must first step back from the stark simplicities of conspiracy and confront the vast, complex, and often shadowy tapestry of history itself. We must understand that the relationship between the Vatican, the spiritual heart of Western Christendom, and the Quran, the revealed word of God for over 1 billion Muslims, was never merely a matter of two faiths existing in parallel. It was, for centuries, a story of confrontation, misunderstanding, fascination, and at its most intense moments, a profound and deeply unsettling encounter with a rival truth. For the medieval church, the world was a divinely ordered hierarchy, a great chain of being descending from God, through his angels, to his Pope in Rome, and then to the kings and commoners of Christendom. This was not just a spiritual map, it was a political and cosmological reality. At the edges of this map lay the unknown, the pagan, and the heretical, and then, in the 7th century, erupting from the deserts of Arabia with breathtaking speed, came Islam. It was not a minor heresy on the fringe, it was a comprehensive, sophisticated, and powerfully successful religious and political empire that conquered vast swathes of what had been the Christian world: Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and all of North Africa and Spain. The Quran, the source of this formidable force, was not just another book. It was the doctrinal engine of a civilization that rivaled and often surpassed Christendom in military power, scientific achievement, and philosophical depth. The initial reaction from the Vatican and the scholars of Europe was a mixture of horror, denial, and polemical fury. Islam was cast as a Christian heresy, its prophet, Muhammad, portrayed as a false prophet, an impostor, or even the Antichrist. The Quran was dismissed as a work of deception, a patchwork of stolen ideas from Jewish and Christian sources, corrupted by the ambitions of its messenger. This was, in part, a theological necessity. To acknowledge the Quran as what it claimed to be a direct, unmediated, and final revelation from the God of Abraham would have shaken the very foundations of Christian doctrine, which rested on the finality of Christ's incarnation and the unique authority of the Church as the sole interpreter of divine will. The existence of the Quran presented a fundamental challenge. What if God had spoken again, outside the established lineage of prophets, outside the sanctioned institutions of the Church, and in a language that was not the sacred Latin of the Vulgate? But beneath this public face of condemnation and refutation, there often simmered a more complex and anxious curiosity. As Crusader armies clashed with Muslim forces in the Holy Land, they encountered not just warriors, but a civilization of immense learning. In the libraries of Toledo, Palermo, and Constantinople, European scholars, often under the patronage of bishops or even popes with more enlightened minds, discovered a treasure trove of knowledge that had been lost to the West. The works of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and Ptolemy, preserved and elaborated upon by Muslim philosophers and scientists. This knowledge, which would eventually fuel the Renaissance, came packaged with the intellectual and theological frameworks of Islam. To study Aristotle's logic was to engage with the commentaries of Avicenna and Averroes. To delve into astronomy or medicine was to navigate texts infused with Quranic concepts of a rational, orderly universe created by a single God. This created a deep and troubling paradox for the Vatican. The very source of a feared and rival faith was also the gateway to knowledge that promised to revitalize a stagnant Christian Europe. This duality, the Quran, as both a threat and a chalice, at the heart of our question. The secrets feared were not necessarily cryptic codes or prophecies of doom hidden within the Arabic verses, though such theories certainly emerged. More profoundly, the secrets were the intellectual and spiritual power contained within the Quran itself. Its compelling monotheism, its logical arguments, its call for a direct relationship with the divine, and its role as the foundation for a scientific and cultural golden age. The fear was that if the true content and power of the Quran were widely understood in the West, It could undermine the authority of the Church, sow doubt among the faithful, and reveal Christendom's own intellectual and perhaps even spiritual deficiencies. Our journey, therefore, is not a search for a single smoking gun document in a Vatican vault, but an exploration of a centuries-long psychological and intellectual struggle. We will trace the evolution of the Vatican's engagement with the Quran, from the early medieval polemics that deliberately distorted its message, to the more nuanced, though still fraught, studies of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. We will examine the moments of dialogue and translation, often undertaken in secret, and the persistent efforts to control the narratives surrounding Islam. We will consider the fear not as a monolithic constant, but as a shifting phenomenon, sometimes a raw terror of military and cultural annihilation, at other times a more subtle anxiety about theological authenticity and the fragility of religious truth in the face of a compelling alternative. The secrets of the Quran, as perceived by the Vatican, were ultimately the secrets of its own enduring challenge to the heart of the Christian West, and it is this challenge, echoing through a millennium of history, that we now begin to unravel. The initial encounter between the rising Islamic civilization and the little established Christian world of the Byzantine Empire and the nascent European kingdoms was cataclysmic. It was not a meeting of scholars in a library, but a collision of empires on the battlefield. The lightning-fast Muslim conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries stripped the Eastern Roman Empire of its wealthiest provinces and severed the Christian heartlands from their historical and spiritual roots in Jerusalem and the Holy Land. For the Church in Rome, still solidifying its authority in the West, this was not merely a political or military disaster, it was a theological earthquake. How could God permit the armies of a new, unknown faith to triumph over the lands sanctified by the blood of Christ and his apostles? The immediate response was not to understand, but to define and condemn. The first Quran known to Christian Europe was not the actual text, but a caricature constructed by theologians who had little to no direct knowledge of Arabic. The most influential of these early polemicists was John of Damascus, a Christian Arab living in the Umayyad Caliphate in the 8th century. Writing in Greek, he had access to the Quran and a working understanding of Islamic beliefs. Yet, his purpose was apologetic, to arm his fellow Christians against the persuasive power of this new faith. He categorized Islam as the foremost Christian heresy of his time. In his seminal work, The Fount of Knowledge, he presented Muhammad not as the founder of a distinct religion, but as a false prophet who had encountered an Arian monk and concocted a creed by blending elements of Christianity and paganism. He misrepresented key Islamic practices, portraying the Hajj pilgrimage as a continuation of pagan Arab idolatry centered around a sacred stone, the Kaaba. This framework, Islam as a heresy, became the dominant lens through which the Vatican and Western Christendom would view their rival for centuries. It was a strategically useful classification. A heresy could be refuted and contained by theological argument. A wholly new and divinely inspired religion could not. By the 9th century, this polemical tradition was formalized in Europe. In the Kingdom of Navarre, a work known as the Codex of the Miktabos contained a Latin translation of the Quran, but it was a translation commissioned with a specific, hostile intent. Its patron, the Abbot of Laer, sought not to understand Islam, but to refute it. The translation was often clumsy and biased, framed by critical commentaries that highlighted what Christians were meant to perceive as errors and contradictions. The Quran's secrets, in this context, were its alleged flaws, which were to be exposed to prove the superiority of Christianity. This intellectual hostility was mirrored by military confrontation. The Crusades, launched in 1095 by Pope Urban II, represented the ultimate fusion of spiritual fervor and political ambition, a direct response to the Vatican's fear of Islam's expanding power. The cry of Deus Vult, God wills it, was a call to reclaim the Holy Land from the infidel. But the reality on the ground in the Crusader states was more complex than the propaganda. Frankish rulers found themselves governing a predominantly Muslim population, and a pragmatic coexistence, albeit an uneasy one, became necessary. Through these contacts, a trickle of more accurate information about Islam began to flow back to Europe. One of the most significant figures of this era was Peter the Venerable, the Abbot of Cluny, in the 12th century, a man of profound learning and curiosity. He was troubled by the fact that the Church was fighting an enemy whose sacred text it did not truly know. He asked a piercing question: How can the refutation of someone ignorant of the faith of the refuted be of any value? During a journey to Spain, a land rich with the cultural legacy of Al-Andalus, Peter initiated a monumental project. He assembled a team of translators, including Robert of Keaton, an English scholar, and a Muslim convert to Christianity, to produce the first complete Latin translation of the Quran, intended for scholarly study, rather than immediate polemic. The resulting work, the Lex Muhammad Pseudo-Prophet, the Law of Muhammad, the False Prophet, was still framed by a critical preface, but the act of translation itself was revolutionary. For the first time, a high-ranking churchman had tacitly acknowledged that to combat Islam effectively, one must first understand its foundational text. The Quran was now, officially, an object of study for the Vatican, but it was a study born of fear and the need for a more sophisticated weapon. The secret fear was no longer just of military defeat, but of the persuasive power contained within the Arabic verses themselves, a power that required a more learned defense. While the Crusader states in the East provided one arena for encounter, it was in Spain where the relationship between Christianity and Islam, and thus between the Vatican and the Quran, reached its most intense and protracted complexity. For nearly 8 centuries, the Iberian Peninsula was a mosaic of Muslim caliphates, emirates, and Christian kingdoms, a world of both brutal warfare and remarkable cultural synthesis, known as convivencia, or coexistence. In cities like Toledo and Granada, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived in a tense but often productive proximity. This environment became the primary conduit through which Islamic knowledge, and by extension, indirect exposure to the worldview of the Quran, flooded into a Europe emerging from the Dark Ages. The Great Translation movement, centered in Toledo after its Christian reconquest in 1085, was a watershed moment in Western intellectual history. Under the patronage of Archbishop Raymond, a team of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars worked tirelessly to translate thousands of manuscripts from Arabic into Latin. The works of Ibn Sina Avicenna on medicine, Ibn Rushd Avros on philosophy, and Al-Khwarizmi on mathematics and astronomy were made accessible to the scholars of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna. This influx of knowledge, rooted in the rationalist traditions fostered by the Islamic world, would directly challenge the scholasticism of the Church and lay the groundwork for the scientific revolution. Yet, this created an immense theological dilemma for the Vatican and the Spanish Church. The very texts that were revitalizing European science and philosophy were saturated with ideas developed in a civilization whose heart was the Quran. The Aristotelianism of Avros, with its arguments for the eternity of the world, and the concept of double truth, that something could be true in philosophy and false in theology, was particularly threatening. The Church was drinking from a well it considered, theologically, to be poisoned. The fear was subtle yet profound, that the logical and scientific brilliance of these Arabic texts could make their source, the Islamic faith, appear intellectually superior. The secret of the Quran, in this context, was its perceived role as a catalyst for a form of rational inquiry that potentially sidelined divine revelation and church authority. This simmering anxiety erupted with the final victory of the Reconquista and the fall of the last Muslim kingdom, Granada, in 1492. The initial promise of religious tolerance made to the defeated Muslims was quickly broken. The Spanish Inquisition, established just a few years earlier, turned its full attention to the problem of Islam within the newly unified Spain. The fear was no longer abstract or intellectual. It was a matter of internal security and religious purity. The large population of Muslims living under Christian rule, and Morisco's Muslims forced to convert to Christianity, was seen as a fifth column, their loyalty suspect, and their secret adherence to Islam a contagion that had to be eradicated. The Quran became a primary target of this campaign of forced conversion and cultural annihilation. The possession of Arabic books, especially the Quran, was banned. Public bonfires of Islamic manuscripts were held in town squares across Spain, destroying not only countless copies of the Holy Book, but also vast libraries of scientific, literary, and philosophical works. The Inquisition's agents sought out and destroyed any text in Arabic, viewing the script itself as a vessel of heresy. The goal was to sever the Moriscos from their spiritual and cultural roots, to force them to forget the language of their revelation. The Vatican, while not directly managing the Spanish Inquisition, supported its aims of creating a homogeneously Catholic Spain. The fear had transformed from one of external military threat to one of internal contamination. The Quran's secret was now the silent, enduring faith it nurtured in the hearts of a subjugated people. A faith that the combined power of the monarchy and the church could not extinguish simply through edict and auto-edict. This violent attempt to silence the Quran in Spain stands as one of the most dramatic testaments to the perceived power the Vatican and its allies believed was contained within its pages. The Renaissance, with its rebirth of classical learning and its spirit of ad fontes, back to the sources, created a new and more ambiguous chapter in the Vatican's relationship with the Quran. The humanists' thirst for original texts extended beyond Greek and Latin to the languages of the East, including Arabic. There was a growing recognition among a new breed of scholar that to truly understand philosophy, science, and even theology, one must engage directly with the Arabic sources, and that meant confronting the Quran on a more textual and linguistic level. This led to a fascinating duality within the heart of the Catholic world itself. On one hand, the Vatican became a major center for the collection of Oriental manuscripts. Popes like Nicholas V in the 15th century actively sought out Arabic texts for the nascent Vatican library, seeing them as treasures of human knowledge. The Medici Pope, Leo X, supported the establishment of a printing press for Arabic texts, hoping to foster better relations with Eastern Christians and perhaps even to missionize in the Orient. The first printed edition of the Quran appeared in Venice in 1530, produced by the pagan printer Paganini and his son. This was a monumental event, theoretically making the text more accessible than ever before. Yet, on the other hand, the old fears persisted and found new expression in the machinery of censorship. The Reformation had shattered the unity of Western Christendom, and the Church of Rome, under the directives of the Council of Trent, launched the Counter-Reformation, a campaign to defend and reassert Catholic orthodoxy. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Prohibited Books, was established to control the flow of dangerous ideas. The Quran, unsurprisingly, was placed on this list. The very same printing press that could disseminate knowledge could also spread heresy. The Paganini Quran of 1530 is shrouded in mystery. Many scholars believe the entire print run was suppressed by the Church, and only a handful of copies are known to exist today. The fear was that a widely available Latin translation could be misused by Protestant reformers to attack the Catholic Church, perhaps by drawing parallels between Islamic criticisms of Christian idolatry and Protestant criticisms of Catholic practices. The Quran's secret, in the eyes of the censors, was its potential as a weapon in the hands of internal enemies. It was in this tense atmosphere that one of the most important scholarly translations was undertaken. In the early 16th century, an Egidio da Viterbo, a cardinal and a renowned humanist, commissioned a new Latin translation of the Quran. He was a complex figure, reform-minded churchman, who also believed in the esoteric wisdom of the Kabbalah. His translator was a German scholar, Johann Albrecht Widmanstitter. Their project was not for public dissemination but for private, scholarly use. Egidio believed that to convert Muslims, one must first understand their scripture with profound accuracy. He represented a strand of thinking within the Church that believed the best defense against the Quran was a superior, scholarly understanding of it, an understanding that could pinpoint its alleged errors with unassailable linguistic precision. This era, therefore, was characterized by a deep internal conflict within the Vatican, a burgeoning intellectual curiosity driven by humanism, clashing with an institutional paranoia fueled by the Reformation. The Quran was simultaneously a prized object of scholarly study, locked away in the Vatican's secret archives, and a forbidden text whose circulation was deemed too dangerous for the faithful. The secret the Vatican feared was no longer just the content of the book, but the unpredictable consequences of its release into the volatile intellectual climate of a Europe divided against itself. The Enlightenment of the 18th century fundamentally shifted the ground beneath the feet of all religious institutions. The Vatican included the rise of rationalism, empiricism, and secularism, posed a far greater immediate threat to the Church's authority than Islam ever had. Thinkers like Voltaire and Hume attacked the very foundations of revealed religion. In this new intellectual landscape, the Quran was increasingly analyzed, not as a heretical Christian text, but as one among many historical religious documents. Scholars like George Sale, whose English translation of the Quran in 1734 included a relatively objective introductory essay, approached it from a more comparative and historical perspective. For the Vatican, the nature of the fear surrounding the Quran began to transform. The primary battle was no longer against Islam, but against secularism and the erosion of religious belief in the West. The Quran, in this context, could even be seen by some reactionary elements as a curious alaya book that, unlike Enlightenment philosophy, still affirmed the existence of God, prophecy, and moral absolutes. However, a new kind of anxiety emerged, one rooted in geopolitics and colonialism. The slow decline of the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, and the subsequent colonial expansion of European powers into Muslim lands created a new dynamic. The Vatican was now engaging with Islam, not as a military superior, but often from a position of political and cultural dominance alongside European empires. This shift did not eliminate the fear, it repurposed it. The concern was less about the Quran, its theological secrets, and more about its power as a mobilizing force for anti-colonial resistance. The Vatican's diplomacy became focused on the protection of Catholic minorities in the Middle East and North Africa, and its relationship with Islamic authorities became a delicate game of political negotiation. The fear was of instability, of nationalist uprisings inspired by religious fervor that could threaten the fragile status quo and the safety of Christian communities. In the 20th and 21st centuries, this political anxiety has only intensified. The end of colonialism, the creation of Israel, the discovery of oil, and the rise of political Islam have kept the Muslim world at the forefront of global politics. The Vatican's approach has officially moved towards dialogue and interfaith understanding, most notably with the landmark documents of the Second Vatican Council, Nostra Aetate, 1965, which called for a respectful recognition of Muslims who adore the one and merciful God. Popes John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis have all made historic gestures of reconciliation. Yet, even in this age of dialogue, traces of the old fears can surface. The concern is no longer that the Quran will reveal a theological truth that undermines Christianity, but that radical interpretations of it will fuel terrorism and social unrest, leading to a clash of civilizations. The Vatican's fear today is multifaceted. It fears for the persecuted Christian minorities in parts of the Muslim world. It fears the breakdown of social cohesion in Europe due to immigration and cultural tensions. And it fears the weaponization of religious texts for violent ends. The secret of the Quran, in the modern context, is often perceived by some as a latent capacity for violence or an inherent resistance to secular modernity, a perception that itself is a legacy of centuries of polemical tradition. So, why did the Vatican fear the Quran's secrets? Our long journey through history reveals that there was no single secret, but a cascade of fears that evolved with the times. Initially, it was the fear of a triumphant heresy, a theological and military challenge that demanded polemical refutation. Then, it was the fear of the intellectual power the Quran had unleashed, a power that Europe needed but whose source it distrusted. In Spain, it was the fear of the book as a symbol of an unassimilable identity within Christendom, leading to attempted destruction. During the Renaissance and Reformation, it was the fear of the text's uncontrolled circulation in an age of printing and religious schism. As we have seen, the relationship was never purely one of antagonism. There were always moments of curiosity, scholarship, and pragmatic engagement. The Vatican's archives themselves bear witness to this complexity, housing both refutations and careful studies. The fear was always intertwined with a reluctant recognition of the Quran's power. In the end, the Vatican's fear of the Quran's secrets was ultimately a fear of the other. Another that was too powerful to intellectually compelling, or too internally resilient to be ignored or easily dismissed. It was a fear born from the challenge that a different revelation posed to its own claim of exclusive truth. This fear compelled the Church to build walls of polemic, to light fires of censorship, and to engage in deep, often secretive, scholarship. The story of this fear is, in many ways, the story of the West's long, troubled, and necessary engagement with the Islamic world. It is a history whose echoes we still hear today, reminding us that the power of a sacred text lies not only in the truths it holds for its believers, but also in the long shadows it casts far beyond its own community of faith. The question, therefore, endures not because of a hidden code within the Quran, but because of the profound and enduring challenge it represents, a challenge that has shaped, and continues to shape, the course of history. Beyond public polemics and publicized translations, a more clandestine engagement with Islamic thought occurred within the highest echelons of the Church. Throughout the Renaissance, certain popes and cardinals, often those steeped in humanist ideals or esoteric traditions, maintained a private fascination with the Quran and Islamic philosophy. Their studies were not for public dissemination, but for their own understanding of what they perceived as a complex theological and cosmological system. This created a stark duality: public condemnation paired with private, intense scrutiny. The fear here was not of the book itself, but of the impact its study might have. If it became widely known among the faithful, the secret was deemed too potent for the masses, something to be handled only by a learned, initiated elite who could, in theory, dissect it without their own faith being contaminated. Figures like Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa in the 15th century wrote works like De Pace Fidei, on the peace of faith, which envisioned a harmonious reconciliation of all religions, including Islam, under one universal truth. While such ideas were visionary, they were also dangerously close to heresy in the eyes of more conservative elements. The fear, therefore, was also internal: a fear that the Quran's arguments, when studied deeply, could lead even princes of the Church down a path of syncretism that undermined the unique truth claims of Catholicism. In the wake of the Counter-Reformation, a new powerful force emerged within the Catholic Church: the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. Founded by Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuits became the intellectual shock troops of the Vatican, renowned for their education, discipline, and strategic acumen. As the age of exploration opened up new frontiers, the Jesuits turned their attention to missionizing in the powerful empires of the East, including the Mughal court in India and the Ming dynasty in China. Their approach to Islam was distinct. Instead of outright condemnation, they adopted a strategy of profound engagement. Jesuits like Roberto de Nobili in India, and later scholars in the Middle East, argued that to convert a Muslim, one must first speak their language, understand their theology, and respect their intellectual traditions. They undertook serious studies of Arabic, Persian, and the Quran, believing that only by mastering the text could they effectively refute it on its own terms. This was a calculated, strategic approach that recognized the intellectual depth of Islamic civilization. The fear driving the Jesuits was not of the Quran's power to seduce, but of the failure of the Church to present a compelling counterargument. Their fear was of ineffective evangelization. They sought to uncover the Quran's secrets, its interpretive traditions, its philosophical underpinnings, not to suppress them, but to use this knowledge as a key to unlock the doors of the Islamic world for Christ. While scholars debated in quiet libraries, a very tangible and terrifying manifestation of Islamic power cast a long shadow over Europe for centuries. The Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman sultans, who also held the title of Caliph, presented a clear and present danger to the very existence of Christian Europe. The sieges of Vienna in 1529 and 1683 were pivotal moments where the armies of Islam stood at the heart of the continent. In this context, the Quran was not merely a theological text. It was the battle standard of a formidable enemy. Papal propaganda depicted the Ottomans as the scourge of God, and the Quran as the book that inspired their jihad. The fear was existential and visceral. It was a fear of conquest, of the replacement of church bells with the call to prayer, and of the subjugation of Christian populations under Islamic rule. This geopolitical threat reinforced the older, more simplistic polemical views of Islam. The complexities of convivencia, or Jesuit scholarship, faded away in the face of the Ottoman armies. The secret of the Quran, during these times of high crisis, was perceived as a blueprint for imperial expansion and religious domination, a belief that was actively fostered by the Vatican to rally Christian princes to a unified defense of the faith. The fear was of a political and religious order diametrically opposed to that of Christendom. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the study of the East, known as Orientalism, began to shift from a primarily religious undertaking to a secular, academic discipline. European scholars, often independent of direct church control, produced critical editions, translations, and historical studies of the Quran that applied the new tools of philology and historical criticism. This movement posed a novel threat to the Vatican. These scholars were not interested in proving the Quran false from a Christian standpoint. Instead, they treated it as a human document, analyzing its sources, its historical context, and its literary structure. The danger for the Church was that this same methodological approach, if applied to the Bible, could undermine the divine inspiration of the Christian scriptures themselves. If the Quran could be deconstructed and shown to have historical antecedents and human authors, what was to stop critics from doing the same to the Old and New Testaments? Thus, the Vatican watched the rise of secular Orientalism with deep apprehension. The secret that these scholars were uncovering was not a hidden prophecy, but the text's humanity, its place in history. This threatened to level the playing field between revelation and human invention, a prospect that was deeply unsettling for an institution built on the unique status of divine revelation in Christ. A less obvious but crucial aspect of the Vatican's relationship with the Quran was its relentless effort to control the physical manuscripts of the text. For centuries, the Vatican Library and other great European libraries, often under papal influence, engaged in a concerted campaign to acquire Arabic manuscripts from around the world. This was not merely an act of scholarly collection. It was a form of intellectual control. By gathering these texts within the walls of Rome, the Church could regulate access to them. Only approved scholars, those with the right theological credentials and intentions, could study them. This hoarding of primary sources allowed the Vatican to shape the narrative about Islam. It could promote translations and studies that served its apologetic purposes, while suppressing or ignoring those that did not. The fear was that if these manuscripts were freely available in universities across Europe, they could give rise to independent and potentially damaging interpretations. The secret was contained within the parchment and ink, and by possessing the physical object, the Church believed it could, to some extent, possess and manage the ideas it contained. Woven through the centuries of engagement with Islam was a potent strand of apocalyptic thought. Many medieval and early modern Christian theologians interpreted the rise of Islam through the lens of biblical prophecy, particularly the books of Daniel and Revelation. Islam was frequently identified with a beast or the false prophet destined to appear before the end times. This gave the encounter a cosmic significance. The Quran, in this interpretation, was not just a heretical book but a tool of the Antichrist. It spread a sign of the impending apocalypse. This belief created a different kind of fear and eschatological dread. The Vatican, as the guardian of orthodoxy, had to navigate these popular and often volatile beliefs. While official doctrine was cautious about specific identifications, the idea that Islam played a role in God's final plan for history was a persistent undercurrent. The secret of the Quran, for those who held this view, was its predetermined role in the ultimate battle between good and evil. This fear was less about intellectual challenge and more about divine prophecy, making the encounter with Islam a matter of cosmic destiny. A recurring subtle fear was the fear of cultural and religious assimilation, not of Muslims becoming Christian, but of Christians becoming Islamicized through prolonged contact. This was particularly acute in border regions like Spain during the Reconquista or in the Crusader kingdoms. Church authorities often issued decrees against Christians adopting Muslim dress, customs, or language. They feared that the outward signs of cultural proximity could lead to a blurring of theological boundaries and, eventually, to apostasy. The Quran's influence, in this context, was not direct but osmotic. Its worldview, embedded in the dominant culture, could seem attractive or normal. The secret was its seductive cultural power, its ability to make the other seem familiar and acceptable. This fear speaks to an anxiety about the fragility of religious identity and the power of a vibrant, sophisticated culture to unconsciously sway the hearts and minds of the faithful, weakening their resolve and distinctiveness. Perhaps one of the most profound fears was realized when Christian thinkers themselves began to use Christo-Islamic philosophy to critique or reinterpret church doctrine. The most famous case was the reception of Avros ibn Rushd in medieval Europe. His commentaries on Aristotle, which emphasized the independence of reason from faith, gave rise to Latin Averroism, a school of thought associated with scholars like Siger of Brabant at the University of Paris. The Latin Averroists argued for philosophical conclusions, such as the eternity of the world, that were in direct contradiction with Christian teaching. Here, the Quranic tradition, filtered through its philosophers, was providing the intellectual ammunition for a challenge to Catholic orthodoxy from within the universities of Christendom. The Vatican had to confront the alarming reality that the secret knowledge contained within the Islamic intellectual universe could empower its own dissidents and heretics. The fear was of a fifth column within the walls, using the tools of the enemy to sabotage the faith from the inside. In the contemporary era, the Vatican faces a new and complex dilemma, rooted in the Second Vatican Council's teachings on religious freedom. The Council's declaration Dignitatis Humanae affirms the right of every person to religious freedom, and Nostra Aetate calls for respectful dialogue with Muslims. This represents a monumental shift from centuries of condemnation. However, this creates a modern tension. How does the Church maintain its fundamental belief that it possesses the fullness of truth, while simultaneously affirming the dignity and validity of another faith tradition whose foundational text it historically feared? The fear today is not of conquest or heresy, but of theological incoherence or relativism. Some within the Church fear that dialogue can blur into syncretism, weakening the Church's evangelizing mission. The secret of the Quran in the 21st century is the challenge it poses to the Church's own ecclesiology. How to be a church both confidently proclaiming its truth and humbly engaging in dialogue with a world of diverse beliefs. The fear is of losing its identity in the process of reaching out. The final, and perhaps most recent, evolution of the fear revolves around the loss of control in the digital age. For centuries, the Church could, to a significant extent, control the narrative about the Quran through its authority, its censorship apparatus, and its possession of physical manuscripts. Today, the Quran is available to anyone with an internet connection, in countless translations and interpretations, from the most scholarly to the most radical. The Vatican can no longer shape the first encounter a seeker or a skeptic has with the text. The fear now is of the Quran's democratization. Its secrets, its beauties, and its potential for misinterpretation are now in the global public square, entirely beyond the Church's influence. This represents the ultimate dissolution of the old models of control. The contemporary fear is not of what the Quran says, but of how it is being read, understood, and weaponized in a fractured, digital world where the Vatican's voice is just one among millions. The challenge has moved from managing a physical text to navigating an endless, unpredictable digital echo chamber. The fear of the Quran's influence was not confined to texts and theological debates. It was etched into stone and mortar, expressed in the very skyline of competing civilizations. For the Vatican, the heart of Christendom's physical and spiritual power was St. Peter's Basilica, a monumental project intended to showcase the might and glory of the Church, especially during the Renaissance. But across the Mediterranean, an equally powerful architectural statement had been made centuries earlier with the construction of the great mosques of the Islamic world, such as the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem and the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. These structures were not merely places of worship, they were profound theological declarations in architectural form. The Dome of the Rock, built directly on the site of the Jewish temple, was a clear assertion of Islam's claim to be the successor and fulfiller of the Abrahamic traditions. Its magnificent dome, a feat of engineering and art, was a direct challenge to the domes of Christian Byzantium. The Vatican, in its ambitious rebuilding of St. Peter's, was in a silent dialogue with these Islamic achievements. The fear was that the splendor of Islamic architecture could project an image of a faith that was not only militarily and intellectually potent, but also divinely favored and aesthetically superior. The secret whispered by these stones was one of a rival sanctity, a claim to space and divine presence that directly contested the Christian narrative of sacred history, a peculiar and potent strand of fear surrounding the Islamic world. And by extension, the culture shaped by the Quran was rooted in gendered fantasies and anxieties. The concept of the harem, the private quarters of women in a Muslim household, became a powerful and distorted symbol in the European imagination. For Vatican-influenced writers and travelers, the harem represented everything that was simultaneously alluring and terrifying about the Orient. It was a space of forbidden sexuality, slavery, and despotic power. This image served a polemical purpose. It painted Islamic society as morally decadent and oppressive to women, thereby framing Christian Europe as the bastion of virtue and gender order. The Quran's teachings on marriage, modesty, and family life were interpreted through this lurid lens. The secret fear here was not theological, but moral and social. It was the fear that the strict moral codes of Christianity could be undermined by the portrayal of a world that, in the European imagination, offered a different and dangerously enticing organization of desire and power. This fear was less about the actual text of the Quran and more about the cultural practices attributed to it, which were used to construct a narrative of Western moral superiority. At the most fundamental level, a primary source of the Vatican's apprehension was the Arabic language itself. The Quran's doctrine of ijaz, or its immutability, holds that its literary and linguistic perfection is proof of its divine origin. For centuries, the vast majority of Christian polemicists did not speak or read Arabic. Their interactions were with often flawed Latin translations that failed to capture the rhythmic beauty, poetic depth, and nuanced meaning of the original. This linguistic barrier was both a shield and a source of deep insecurity. The Church knew it was arguing against a shadow, a poorly understood version of the text. There was a lurking fear that within the original Arabic, there were arguments or a spiritual power that the clumsy Latin translations could not convey, and that their own theological arsenal was therefore inadequate. The secret was locked within the language. Mastering Arabic became, for some churchmen, a crucial but dangerous task. It was dangerous because to truly master the language was to risk understanding the opponent's point of view with a sympathy that could undermine the polemical mission. The fear was that the Quran's true power was ultimately untranslatable, residing in a sonic and spiritual experience accessible only to those who heard it in its revealed tongue. The relationship between the Vatican and the Islamic world was never solely spiritual. It was also profoundly economic. During the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the trade routes that brought spices, silks, and other luxuries from the East to Europe were largely controlled by Muslim powers, whether the Mamluks of Egypt or the Ottomans. This economic dependence created a complex and uncomfortable reality for Christendom. The wealth that funded the Renaissance palaces, and even the art within the Vatican itself, often flowed along channels controlled by the perceived enemy. This generated a fear rooted in realpolitik. The Quran was the law that governed these powerful mercantile empires. Their economic strength, derived from trade, reinforced their military and cultural power. The secret fear was that Christendom's material comfort and luxury were dependent on a civilization whose spiritual foundations it rejected. This created a sense of vulnerability and even hypocrisy, a fear that the pursuit of worldly goods was making Europe complicit in strengthening its rival. The Crusades themselves were, in part, motivated by a desire to break this Muslim monopoly on Eastern trade and establish direct access to the sources of wealth. While the Vatican focused much of its attention on the legal and theological aspects of Islam, another, more subtle challenge emerged from its mystical dimension: Sufism. Sufi orders, with their emphasis on direct personal experience of the divine, spiritual love, and ecstatic practices, presented a problem that was harder to combat than formal theology. How does one polemicize against a claim of inner light? Some Christian mystics, like Ramon Lull, saw in Sufism a potential bridge for dialogue, a shared language of the heart. For the more institutional-minded in the Vatican, however, Sufism was another kind of threat. Its emphasis on a personal path to God bypassed the need for the Church's sacramental mediation, mirroring in some ways the challenges posed by Protestant mystics. The secret of the Quran, as expressed through Sufism, was its capacity to foster a profound spirituality that could appear, to an outsider, to be as valid and intense as Christian mysticism. This fear was of a spiritual equivalence, a recognition that the yearning for God and the experience of divine love were not the exclusive property of Christianity. A persistent strategic fear for the Vatican was the potential alliance or theological common ground between Islam and Judaism. The Quran itself speaks respectfully of the people of the book and acknowledges the shared lineage of Abraham. In medieval Spain, there were notable instances of intellectual collaboration between Jewish and Muslim scholars. For the Church, which often positioned itself as the sole true inheritor of the Abrahamic covenant, this was a troubling prospect. The fear was that the two older monotheistic faiths could find a basis for unity against what they might both see as Christian deviations, such as the doctrine of the Trinity. The Vatican's policies often involved playing these groups against each other, but the underlying anxiety remained that the Quran's explicit recognition of Judaism could provide the foundation for a strategic or intellectual alliance that would isolate Christianity. The secret was a potential ecumenism of the other that excluded the Church. The maps produced in medieval and Renaissance Europe under the influence of the Church reveal a cognitive fear. These maps, such as the two maps, often placed Jerusalem at the center of the world, with Europe, Asia, and Africa arranged around it. The Islamic world, when it was depicted, was frequently placed on the edges, sometimes populated with monstrous creatures. This was a form of cartographic polemics. By literally marginalizing the Islamic world, mapmakers attempted to diminish its theological and geographical significance. The fear was of Islam's centrality and power. Redrawing the map was an attempt to control the narrative, to reassure the Christian viewer that their world was the center of God's plan, and that the realm of the Quran was a peripheral aberration. The secret the maps tried to hide was the true scale, sophistication, and central geographical position of the Islamic caliphates, which in reality controlled the heartlands of the ancient world. In response to the vast knowledge contained within the Islamic world, the Vatican and other European powers embarked on a project to create universal libraries. The Vatican Library itself became an archive intended to contain all knowledge, both orthodox and heretical. The impulse to collect every book, including the Quran and works of Islamic philosophy, was driven by a desire for total mastery. By gathering all texts under one roof, the Church could aspire to a God's-eye view of human thought. It could compare, categorize, and ultimately refute any challenge to its doctrine. The fear that motivated this immense project was the fear of an unknown or uncontrolled idea. The secret the Vatican sought to possess was not any single truth, but the totality of knowledge itself, believing that within a complete archive, its theologians could find the answer to every possible challenge. It was an attempt to turn the Babel of competing revelations into an ordered, manageable system where Catholic truth would inevitably triumph. Beneath all the layers of political, military, and intellectual fear, there perhaps lay a deeper, more profound anxiety, one that was rarely articulated, but may have been the most powerful of all: the fear of being wrong. What if, after all, the Quran was exactly what it claimed to be? What if God had indeed sent a final prophet to the Arabs? What if the Christian understanding of God's plan was incomplete? This was the unthinkable question, the ultimate secret fear that gave energy to all the others. It was the reason why engagement with the Quran had to be controlled, why polemics had to be vehement, and why the text itself had to be framed as a deception. To entertain this possibility was to risk the entire theological edifice of Western Christianity. Therefore, the immense effort spent over centuries to refute, contain, and fear the Quran can be seen as a massive defense mechanism against this terrifying doubt. The real secret was not in the Quran's verses, but in the silent, unsettling question it planted in the mind of Christendom, a question about the finality of its own revelation.